In the last class, we talked about how the 19th century was built on from the colonial experience of the Americas, resulting in racism and race, capitalism, and sexism. But there were also these anti-voices like William Apis, like Frederick Douglass, Marx and Engels, Lucy Parsons. In general, I think, well, as we said, many people believe that we are in similar times to the 19th century. Perhaps we are more 19th century than they were in the 19th century. But in any case, we can see that these were tumultuous times, times of upheaval, social change. And as we talked about, most of the writers from that section were people who were wanting to affect change. They may not have even been writing too much down. They were talking to people, making speeches, advocating for social change. That's who we read about. On the other hand, we have this tumultuous time. But in your book, in the section to describe this section, they say that scientific racism, and we should probably put that in quotes because it was not scientific at all, not only survived such changes, but thrived in the West, particularly in the United States. So there's a lot of social change, and there are people speaking out against scientific racism, to be sure, but it seems to be becoming even more entrenched despite the social changes. Emergent science of eugenics drew on the most pernicious claims of social evolutionism. So if we remember, social evolutionism is the idea that people are divided into these stages of savagery, barbaric, and civilization, but then you could subdivide them into other stages. To specify and strengthen racial classifications that were hierarchically ordered from superior to inferior. Now, this is it by your editors. So we have this tumultuous time, but eugenics and scientific racism are in some ways getting more established. Now, this section is called On Methods of Fieldwork, but I would prefer to call it Anthropology, because up until this time, we've only read one person who would have officially considered himself to be an anthropologist, who is Lewis Henry Morgan. And here we're starting to see an emergence of people who are famous for founding the discipline. And so we're seeing people who kind of emerged at the very beginnings of anthropology. Now, in a class not too long ago, maybe our second class, I talked about how that we were reading about the roots of anthropology, and that anthropology was founded on some key questions. It was basically a discipline that was coming out of Europe and North America, and it was not studying people in Europe and North America. So unlike sociology or economics or political science, which was basically founded to study themselves or ourselves, anthropology was put out to study all the rest of the people. And we said that they had these questions like, hey, why are other people like that? Are the inequalities that we see natural and given and inevitable in the world? And can society be changed? And like we just said, the 19th century is a time of social tumult and change. And so people were looking to change society. Can it be changed? And I claimed, as I often do, that this is the questions that anthropology began with. I already talked to you about those. But it strikes me that I should be more definitive in the sense that what was going on during this time, from say the 1880s to the 1930s, during this birth period of anthropology, is that a lot of people, I'm going to say the white elites in Europe and America had already decided on the answers to these questions. It was already established for them. Basically, the reason other people were the way they were was either because of their race was determining the status and their capabilities and the way they were, or linked to their environment, the natural environment. That's why people were different. It's because they're racially different. And if you ask people, are the inequalities that we see natural and inevitable? The answer was pretty much yes, because of evolution. Because that's the way that the survival of the fittest orders people. And so the things you see are always going to emerge. Or if you were kind of more old-fashioned, you just say, yeah, because God created things that way. And hey, what can you do about it? So if you ask them, can society be changed? The predominant answer was probably not. It's going to be the same way it is. But if you can change it, if it is possible to be changed, it's probably because you can, in the more progressive sense, you can educate people to go from, say, savagery up to barbarism, or from barbarism up to civilization. You can progress them along, or you can just do some eugenics on them. That's how you change society. By the way, what does that mean, to do eugenics on people? Programs of involuntary sterilization to try to stop people from reproducing, or, so as the idea is, okay, evolution is survival of the fittest, and there are certain people who are not fit and they shouldn't be able to reproduce. And this was actually seen, this is going to sound weird, but some people considered this to be a progressive idea, that they were going to help bring human progress by, if somebody was mentally deficient, then they shouldn't be able to have kids. Now, this is actually not the best, how to say, it's not good science. It's not, when we learn about evolution, it's actually not about survival of the fittest. It's about differentials in reproduction, and you need variability in order for evolution to proceed. So people who are trying to wipe out certain traits, that's not really good for evolution, but that was the idea. So again, when anthropology comes out, most people had already decided on the answers to these questions, and they weren't the best answers. And so when anthropologists go out and try and do their field work, I would basically say that what this amounts to is, hey, let's go out there and actually try to answer these questions instead of assuming that we know the answers from simply reflecting upon them from the comfort of our library, our armchair, or reading the Bible. And so, the idea is, let's go find out what's going on. Let's at least ask these as questions and not simply postulate them as answers. Now, in part because some of you have to leave, we are going to take these articles slightly out of order, but I think the order makes sense. First, we'll begin with the extremely invigorating and exciting article that Seth gave us, which is The Origin of the Iroquois. In the introduction, they say they cut out a lot of this. They actually cut this down to it was much longer. He went on and on. You weren't entranced by this description of their pottery? It is on page 46. Typical Iroquoian pottery is known both by its shape and by its decoration. The typical pot has a globular body that, as it turns inward toward the top, turns upward and outward into a constricted neck and a flaring or overhang collar, respectively. The width of the neck at its base is about 1/6 of the circumference of the body, and it rises if from the top of an imaginary hexagon drawn inside the globe. From the top of the neck, which turns outward like the bell of a trumpet, rises a collar, sometimes round, but as often four-sided, and having an upward turn at each corner.
Are you out of breath? And that was it for
For every single one. You can see why they say a picture tells 1,000 words, because boy, he went on and on about all these things. And I guess because he didn't have PowerPoint to just show you an example of Iroquois pottery, I think, or of these beautiful pipes. You know, probably stole this from some other picture.
They argue half.
Now you might wonder what, like Seth wonders, why all of this? Now, our authors, or editors, I should say, give us a reason for why they've included this. And I think that this is the most important part. When he's going along, you notice that he's just like, well, the Iroquois didn't have stone hoes, but they made great pipes. And they might not have had this, but they made great pottery. And they were very interested in this part of decoration, but not that part of decoration. And what he's trying to say here, or by simply kind of categorizing, or not categorizing, by simply describing their material culture, is he's basically what he's not doing is trying to rank them in any sort of hierarchical order. He's saying that, hey, you know, they had these pipes, they had this pottery, they had certain techniques for doing things. And you're not going to be able to say, well, that means that they are at this stage of civilization, or they were just about to develop something else. It just means that's what they did. That's where they are. And we're just trying to figure out who they are by doing field work and archaeology on them. And so they're just standing on their own. So again, the idea is you can't necessarily put people in these civilizational evolutionary boxes based on their material culture or their technology. Now, in similar fashion, Margaret Mead gives us some ideas here. Well, her title is The Methodology of Racial Testing. The Methodology of Racial Testing. What was at stake here when Margaret Mead is writing? This comes to us from 1926. What is at stake in talking about racial testing for stuff like intelligence?
White people's egos. It's true.
That is at stake here. You gave us a great sentence. Worn out dogmas and hot partisans.
In conclusion, white people's egos.
Well, maybe. I mean, the thing is that this, I think you said that this is pretty relevant to today. We are definitely in an era of worn out dogmas and hot partisanships, and we are still there. That has not changed. In fact, you gave me a video about different test scores and how students go into school. And I scrolled into the comments, and sure enough, somebody's like, yeah, there's an IQ difference, duh. Hot dogmas and worn out dogmas, hot dogmas and worn out partisanships. Doesn't matter, you can swap those around. But it's arguably more, there was even more at stake than white people's egos in 1926. What's at stake in talking about racial testing for intelligence? Huh? Well, certainly people are talking about putting people in different neighborhoods. Think, we've already talked about it. It's 1926. Rewind in your mind. What are they going to do with that information? Eugenics. Eugenics is at stake here. Population sterilized. And if you want to look at the history of medicine and why African Americans might be a little bit suspicious of the medical tradition, it's because they got exposed to all this stuff from early on, and, you know, involuntary sterilizations. Margaret Mead is going to be arguing against these ideas. One, she says they have a faulty measure of race. So there's that whole section on racial admixture in which they're just looking at people and deciding how much Black ancestry they have, and then corresponding them to their scores on these tests. I think if we put that into today's terms, and like as Amy said, I believe that these things are completely relevant today, we might recognize that what they were actually measuring was something that is that people don't talk about so much, but is pretty well documented attribute of the world, which is this idea of colorism, where even among people who are classified as Black or African American, there is often a preference for the skin color and the features that are more predominant among or that are seen as whiteness. And this happens within the Black and African American community, as well as it's something that white people do as well. And so basically probably what was going on here is the people who had lighter skin were given some advantages in this society, and that's why they were probably scoring higher on some of these tests. She says that they did a terrible measure of social status, which again is probably what was happening here. And that is actually true today as well. Oftentimes we don't have we don't have actually, they do this by income because we can get income more readily than we can wealth, but it still breaks down pretty much the same. If you look at the SAT scores or the tests that children, high school students take, they almost perfectly correlate to how much wealth is in people's families. And in areas of higher wealth, you're going to see higher SAT scores. She also talks about linguistic disability and the Italians here. In today's world, we would probably call this, that the tests have a cultural bias, right? They're organized toward, they set themselves up as a neutral IQ test, but a lot of the questions are organized toward the dominant society. So what Margaret Mead says is we need to have extreme caution in any attempt to draw conclusions concerning the relative intelligence of different racial or nationality groups. And again, this is 1926. Remember, we're going into, we don't know it yet, but the sort of storms of what would become World War II and what would become Nazi Germany are brewing. And we probably should not forget that Hitler looked to the United States as an example for what he wanted to do in terms of how people were segregated and organized by race, and how race was used on census forms and all these things. That was seen as like good stuff for him. That the United States had it right. So, again, in a time, I guess what I'm urging us to do is to look at all of these pieces, these 5 pieces, in the context of a time in which people are trying to box people into racial determinism, environmental determinism, and social evolutionism. We also have the famous linguist, Edward Sapir. Abby, what did you get out of this? He's a fun guy. More fun than Lucy Parsons?
I didn't look into it first.
Oh yeah, he was a fun guy. No, maybe not so fun, but anyway, yeah. What do you got?
It describes how language shapes culture.
Yeah, he was very interested in the shaping of culture by language. He's associated with what is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which would talk about how, how our language in some ways is determining of our thoughts. In this article, he talks about how our vocabulary, right, is reflective of our social interests. And so he talks about, how people in certain areas might be interested in the topography, and so they have a bunch of different words for and others might be interested in and fishing and different maritime features. And what he's claiming here is that the vocabulary, it might be based on the natural environment, but only if that's what the people are themselves interested in. So he makes the case here on page 41 that if you look at the vocabulary, it's the interest of the people in such environmental features. Were the Nootka Indians dependent for their food supply primarily on land hunting and vegetable products, despite their proximity to the sea, there's little doubt their vocabulary would not be as thoroughly saturated as it is with sea lore. So what he's trying to say is that people's vocabulary is going to have a lot to do with what they're interested in, what they're actually doing in their environment. And then later on in this article, he makes a hugely important point that in terms of the sounds people make, and what we might call the phonetics and the grammar of a language, it has no relationship to the natural environment in which they are in. So he talks about the people of widely different environments and belonging to widely different cultural strata. And so he talks about the use of a pitch accent, basically a tonal system where the tone changes, is found in Chinese, and then the U and other languages of Western Africa, Hottentot in South Africa, Swedish, Tiwa in New Mexico, and Takalina in southwestern Oregon. Then he talks about nasalized vowels, which occur not only in French and Portuguese, but also in Iroquois and Siouan. Stop consonants, all these other places. So basically what he's saying is we find these phonetic features in all kinds of different natural environments, which means the whole idea that you could measure people and their throats and measure their larynxes and all these things and find out something about them would be inaccurate. Boas, often seen as the founder of North American anthropology, here is writing about the methods of ethnology. Very importantly, he takes this up. And that's why, Pluto, I was excited that you chose this article, because he starts off by explicitly arguing against people like Spencer, Morgan, Tyler, Lubbock, to mention only a few. And he says that they were under the spell of the idea of a general uniform evolution of culture in which all parts of mankind participate. And so what Boas here is saying is, again, he's explicitly arguing against that social evolutionism that we read about before, the idea that everyone is locked or progresses through these stages. And what he tells us is the idea of either socioevolution or what he calls diffusion, that is traits that spread out across the world, are both hypotheses. And that in fact, if you look at them as hypotheses, if you go out and test the hypothesis of one single general line of development, that it cannot be maintained, that you cannot actually sort people into these stages and that everybody is on this line, their own line. How should we look at them, Pluto? Should we see these cultural groups? How should we study them? Yeah, they're influenced by others and those around them, and that each cultural group has its own unique history. Just to say they're not all progressing in the same way, they're not on the same line, they can't be sorted into stages. And although he doesn't use this term in this writing, he is associated with the idea of historical particularism. Again, the idea that in each society, you have its own history, and you can't make a general law. They all don't follow their same course of evolution. You need to study each society historically, or as he puts it, we do not hope to be able to solve an intricate historical problem by a formula. You can't just apply the same mathematical or formula or law to all different kinds of societies. So now we come to the person who might be the most interesting of them all, Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, Hurston becomes much more of a novelist than she becomes an anthropologist, and is much better at writing than any of them were. So here we have, I mean, a lot of people don't realize, I mean, her work has been recuperated, but a lot of, I mean, she mentions Franz Boas. She, like others, like Margaret Mead, like Ruth Benedict, was trained or participated in the same circles, was a student with Franz Boas. Of course, she was also an insider to this community. And when she wanted to do her anthropology, she didn't go to a place that was, she went back to her hometown. But I think that should, I mean, the truth is that she did a long periods of field work in the South, in her hometown, and in areas that she was not familiar with. She also went to Haiti. She did more field work than most of the Boasians, than most of the people who got trained. She actually did a ton of field work. However, that work was not recognized by the academy. She never became a professor or the chair, or was, she was not given academic recognition for that work. Now, part of that was because the academy was quite hierarchically white and elitist. But the other reason, or another possible reason that happened, is she also got rejected by, the people who were trying to be the gatekeepers of Black literary work. And I mean, as you might notice from reading this passage, she's just trying to tell it like it is, right? She's trying to find the great folklore in her own society. Whereas the people kind of at the top of this wanted to do something else. They kind of wanted to reject that in favor of, kind of what they considered to be high literary achievement. So she got shunted out of some of the, probably also having to do with her being a woman. And so it's only when she died, she was actually broke, and nobody knew about her. And it has only been in the last, I'm gonna say maybe 40 years, 40 or 50 years, that her work has been really recuperated and re-examined. But at the time, she was unable to break through into this. I mean, she did have these breakout books which sold quite well, but a lot of it then got forgotten. So in this section, we have 5 selections, and what I've been trying to argue is that during this time, there was a pretty secure idea that the differences among people, could be ascribed to their racial difference, or their natural environment, and that all peoples were going from primitive up to modern people on a line of unilineal social evolutionism. And whether that was rooted in a more racist framework or a more social framework like Lewis Henry Morgan, it was nevertheless pretty strong at the time. In contrast, anthropologists began doing this thing called fieldwork, which is, hey, if you have these ideas, instead of imposing the ideas upon the data, why don't we go out and ask people and talk to people and interview them and see what's going on out there, or categorize or talk about their material culture. And from that, the idea that we had to look at people in a historical way and to talk about their societies. Now, for the most part, in these selections, you actually don't hear the word culture being used very much. That's going to come up to us later. It's relatively less used, but with Ruth Benedict and her book Patterns of Culture, that idea is then going to be introduced. So that would be the idea that anthropologists had as to what explained human difference, that it wasn't racially determined, but it was part of culture. And if it was part of culture, then we should be able to have this thing that we now know of as cultural relativism, or be able to at least understand people's societies from within their own frameworks.